December 1943, North Africa. An American general stops his jeep in the middle of ancient ruins. His officers wait for orders, but Patton isn't looking at maps. He's staring at thousand-year-old stones and whispers, "I've died here before." His officers exchange glances. It's not the first time, because George S. Patton, the man who commanded the most advanced war machine in history, carried a secret he revealed only to a few. He believed his soul was 3,000 years old, that he had fought alongside Alexander the Great, that he had died at Carthage, that he had ridden with Napoleon, and this belief wasn't some old general's fantasy. It was the fuel that made him unstoppable. In the next 25 minutes, you'll discover the real story behind Patton's spiritual obsession, how it shaped his tactics, why he had no fear of death, and the moment when this belief almost destroyed his career. But first, you need to understand where it all began. And the answer isn't in a military academy. It's in a California library in 1892, when a 7-year-old boy who couldn't read started having visions of battles he had never seen. 1885, California, George Patton Jr. is born into a family obsessed with war. But here's the detail nobody tells you. Young Patton couldn't read until he was 12 years old. Modern doctors believe he had severe dyslexia. His father had to read everything to him: Homer's Iliad, Caesar's Gallic Wars, the campaigns of Frederick the Great. Most children would hate this. Patton became addicted. But something strange happened during these reading sessions. According to his own diaries, which would only be published decades after his death, Patton began to remember details that weren't in the books. When his father read about Roman legions, Patton would interrupt. "No, the centurions didn't position themselves like that. They stayed on the flank." His father would ask, "How do you know?" Young Patton couldn't explain. He just knew. This wasn't imagination. In 1897, when Patton was 12, he wrote his first poem. It was called Through a Glass Darkly, a direct reference to reincarnation. The poem described a warrior who had fought in all the great battles of history. His family thought it was creative writing. Patton believed it was memory. 1904, Patton enters West Point Military Academy and immediately fails his first year. Not because he wasn't smart, but because he couldn't pass written exams fast enough. His dyslexia made every test a nightmare. Most cadets would quit. Patton repeated the entire year. But here's where his belief in reincarnation became his secret weapon. While other cadets saw failure as humiliation, Patton saw it as another test the universe was giving him, just like in his previous lives. In a letter to his father in 1905, he wrote, "I have died in battle many times. Failing a mathematics exam is nothing compared to a Roman gladius through the chest." This wasn't bravado, this was genuine belief, and it made him fearless in a way his classmates couldn't understand. When you believe you've died dozens of times before, academic failure loses its power over you. By 1909, Patton graduated, not at the top of his class, but as the cadet with the highest marks in military tactics and strategy. Why? Because while others were memorizing books, Patton was remembering battles. 1913, Patton is now a young cavalry officer, and he writes a poem that would become infamous among military historians. It's called Through a Glass Darkly, the same title from his childhood, but now expanded into 17 stanzas. Listen to these lines. "So, forever in the future shall I battle as of yore, dying to be born a fighter, but to die again once more." This isn't metaphor. Patton genuinely believed he was trapped in an eternal cycle of warfare. But the most disturbing stanza comes at the end. "I have battled with the Persians, I have charged with Murad's host, I have whispered in the darkness where the berserk slew the most." Patton names specific battles, specific commanders, specific moments. And when historians later cross-referenced these claims with actual historical events, they found something unsettling. Patton's descriptions were accurate, down to tactical details that weren't widely known in 1913. Either he was an obsessive history scholar hiding his research, or he genuinely believed he was remembering these battles. And based on what happened next, the evidence points to the latter. Because in 1918, when Patton faced real combat for the first time, he didn't act like a new soldier. He acted like a veteran of 1,000 wars. September 26, 1918, Meuse-Argonne Offensive, France. Captain George S. Patton leads the 1st American Tank Brigade into combat, and within 3 hours, he's shot. A German machine gun bullet hits him in the upper leg, dangerously close to the femoral artery. He's bleeding heavily. His men want to evacuate him. Patton refuses. According to eyewitness testimony from Sergeant Joseph Angelo, who would later receive the Distinguished Service Cross for staying with Patton, the captain said something that stunned everyone around him. "I've been shot before. This isn't how I die." Angelo asked him what he meant. Patton, losing blood, replied, "I've died in battle 6 times. Machine gun fire isn't one of them. I die by cavalry charge." This wasn't delirium. This was Patton's genuine belief system operating under extreme stress. And here's the terrifying part. He was right. The bullet missed the artery by less than an inch. If it had hit, he would have bled out in minutes. But Patton's belief in his destiny kept him calm enough to apply pressure correctly and survive until medics arrived. Modern combat psychologists call this mission-focused resilience. Patton called it remembering how to die properly. May 1916, 2 years before France. Lieutenant Patton is part of General Pershing's expedition into Mexico, hunting Pancho Villa's forces. And Patton does something that makes him a legend overnight. He kills 3 of Villa's lieutenants in a gunfight. But the official military report leaves out the most important detail. According to Patton's personal diary, which remained classified until 1979, he approached the hacienda where the targets were hiding and immediately knew the layout of the building. He had never been there before. No maps existed, but Patton told his men exactly where the doors were, where the sight lines would be, where the ambush would come from. And he was right. When his men asked how he knew, Patton said, "I fought here before, different century, same land." After the gunfight, Patton carved notches into his revolver grip, 1 for each kill. But then he did something bizarre. He strapped the 3 dead men to the hood of his car and drove back to base with the bodies displayed like hunting trophies. Modern officers would call this a war crime. In 1916, it made Patton a hero in the newspapers. But here's what the newspapers didn't know. Patton believed he had killed these same men before, in a previous life. The notches weren't for this lifetime's kills. They were a continuation of an ancient scoreboard. After Mexico, Patton started carrying 2 revolvers, not 1, 2. Most people think it was for show, a cowboy general playing dress up. The truth is far darker. In a 1927 letter to his wife Beatrice, Patton explained why he carried 2 ivory-handled revolvers. "If one gun fails, I won't be caught defenseless like I was at Cannae, the battle where Hannibal destroyed the Roman legions in 216 BC. Patton believed he had been there, and he believed he had died because his weapon broke. So in this lifetime, he carried backups. Always. Here's the proof. This wasn't just eccentricity. During World War II, Patton's sidearm jammed twice in combat situations. Both times, he immediately drew his second revolver without hesitation, a reaction speed that can only come from muscle memory or genuine paranoia. His officers thought he was paranoid. Patton thought he was learning from past mistakes. And when you're commanding an army, that kind of redundancy thinking saves lives. The 2 revolvers weren't props. They were proof of a man who genuinely believed he had died from equipment failure before and refused to let it happen again. July 1943, Operation Husky, the Allied invasion of Sicily. General Patton is given command of the U.S. 7th Army. His mission? Capture the island and beat British General Montgomery to Messina. And then, something inexplicable happens. During a briefing with his staff, Patton looks at the topographical maps of Sicily and says, "These maps are wrong. This valley here," he points, "is wider than shown, and there's a Roman road that still exists under the dirt here." His intelligence officers are confused. The maps come from aerial reconnaissance. How could Patton know they're wrong? He shouldn't. But when his engineers scout the valley, they find he's exactly right. The valley is 40 meters wider than the aerial photos suggested. And when they dig, they find ancient Roman paving stones, a hidden supply route. Patton uses this forgotten road to outflank German positions and reach Messina 4 hours before Montgomery. After the campaign, war correspondent Ernie Pyle asked Patton how he knew about the Roman road. Patton's response, recorded in Pyle's notes, "I built it, long time ago." Pyle thought Patton was joking. his staff knew he wasn't. August 1943, 2 weeks after the Sicily triumph, General Patton visits a field hospital to award medals to wounded soldiers, and he encounters a private suffering from what we now call PTSD, but in 1943 was dismissed as battle fatigue or cowardice. Patton loses control. He slaps the soldier twice and screams at him to get back to the front. The incident becomes a national scandal. General Eisenhower nearly fires him. The press demands his resignation. But here's what drove Patton to that moment. In his worldview, shaped by his reincarnation beliefs, there was no such thing as psychological wounds, only physical ones. He had died dozens of times in previous lives. He had been stabbed, shot, and trampled, and each time he came back to fight again. So when he saw a soldier with no visible wounds claiming he couldn't fight, Patton genuinely couldn't comprehend it. In a private letter to his wife after the incident, Patton wrote, "How can a man be broken by something as simple as fear? I have faced death in 100 forms. Fear is just memory of danger." This is the dark side of Patton's belief system. The same mindset that made him fearless also made him incapable of empathizing with psychological trauma. He was forced to apologize publicly, but in private, he never understood what he did wrong. Because in his mind, fear was just a failure to remember that death is temporary. December 9th, 1945, 7 months after Germany's surrender. General Patton is in a car accident near Mannheim, Germany. A truck collides with his vehicle. Patton suffers a broken neck. He's paralyzed from the neck down. Doctors give him days to live. According to his wife Beatrice, who was at his bedside, Patton's final conversations were about his next assignment. He told her, "This is how it ends this time, but I'll be back. I always come back." On December 21st, 1945, Patton dies from a pulmonary embolism. But here's the detail that haunts military historians. 3 weeks before his accident, Patton told his chief of staff, General Hobart Gay, that he had a feeling he wouldn't live to see 1946. When Gay asked why, Patton said, "I've lived long enough this time. The war is over. Warriors don't die in peacetime. We die between wars, waiting to return." Patton's death certificate lists the cause as accident, but his final words, documented by the attending nurse, were, "It's time to move on to the next one. Not next life, not heaven. The next one," implying the next war, the next battle, the next incarnation. Whether you believe in reincarnation or not, the evidence is undeniable. George S. Patton lived and died believing he was an eternal warrior, and that belief made him one of the most effective generals in human history. So, what do we do with this story? Some will say Patton was mentally ill, that his belief in reincarnation was delusion or ego. But the evidence suggests something different. His memories gave him tactical advantages that saved thousands of American lives. His fearlessness inspired armies. His redundancy thinking, born from a belief he had died from equipment failure before, became standard military doctrine. Modern psychologists have a term for what Patton did: productive delusion. A belief system that, true or not, produces measurable positive results. Patton believed he was a 3,000-year-old warrior, and whether that was literally true doesn't matter, because that belief made him act like a 3,000-year-old warrior. And in war, action is the only truth that matters. The Roman soldier in the Sherman tank wasn't a metaphor. It was how Patton genuinely saw himself, an ancient warrior reborn into a modern body, using modern weapons, fighting the same eternal war. And the strangest part, when you read his tactical decisions through that lens, as if he genuinely was remembering ancient battles, they suddenly make perfect sense. Which leaves us with one final question. Was Patton right? Or was he just the most functional madman in military history? I'll let you decide. But either way, the man who believed he died 100 times only truly died once, and history has never seen another general like him since. Subscribe for more untold military history.